He says, your words have been arrogant against me. Yet you say, what have we spoken against you? They're so blinded by their circumstances, so frustrated by life, they've given up on God that they don't even know how they have failed Him. Verse 14. You have said it is vain to serve God. And what profit is it that we have kept His charge and that we have walked in mourning before the Lord of hosts? He says, here's what your actions are. They are selfish. You are looking at one another, gathering together this circle of friends, and you're asking yourselves, what good is this? What good is this that we have given ourselves to serve God? And look what he said in the last part of verse 14. He said, what profit is it to have kept His commands or His charges, and that we have walked in mourning before the Lord of hosts? They said, we're doing everything we're supposed to do. We're going through the motions. We are putting ourselves out and going through this self-effacing action. On the surface, we have everything in place. We're going when we should, and we're doing what you have asked. But God, what have you done for us lately? They saw their relationship with God as some sort of a bargain. Jamison, Fawcett, and Brown say this: the Jews here mistake utterly the nature of God's service, converting it into a mercenary bargain. They attended to outward observances, not from love to God, but in the hope of being well paid for it in outward possessions. Hoping to be well paid for it in outward possessions. When this was withheld, they charged God with being unjust, forgetting alike that God requires very different motives from theirs to accompany outward observances, and that God rewards even the true worshiper not so much in this life as in the life to come. They were grading God on how their lives had turned out, and God said, you have missed the entire purpose of this relationship. Their motives were outward. Their motives were selfish. They wanted God to give them comfort. They wanted God to give them money. They wanted God to give them political supremacy. And God said, that's not what I've called you to. I've called you to a life of piety and holiness. I've called you to these actions, but not simply for the actions. If you back up in chapter 3 where we saw last week, God had proclaimed over and again that they needed revival. They needed a change in their lives. And they said, we don't know what we've done. How do we change this? He said, it's in your tithes and your offerings. He said, it's in the way that you worship. And God wasn't saying that they simply needed to bring that tenth, that they needed to bring the gift above the tenth, because they could do those things and still do them for the wrong reasons, or they could do them without their hearts ever changing. They could come to God and worship very begrudgingly. But God, the reason God told them that they needed to do tithes and offerings, because He knew that would be a heart matter. That for them to change the way they worshiped would mean they had to change everything about their lives, and only God and His Spirit at work in them could do that. They were trying to bargain with God, but in thus doing had become simply religious people. Chuck Swindoll has several quotes about religious people. He quotes Mark Twain, who said, having spent considerable time with good religious people, I can understand why Jesus liked to be with tax collectors and sinners. Mark Twain. Swindoll says this: it's often difficult to preach to a religious audience. To paraphrase Matthew 22:14, many are cold and a few are frozen. Stedman says this: we're all molded by God, but some are moldier than others. That was the group to which God is speaking through Malachi. They had become so moldy, so stuffy. They were going through the motions of religion, but simply wanting God to give them comfort or fulfillment. They were self-centered and thus very selfish. And what they needed was a good dose of self-denial. In 1986, 24 years ago, John Johnston wrote an article in Christianity Today and saw in that day's Christianity what we see even today. He said, self-denial is the perennial challenge of humanity. A rampant selfishness is omnipresent in every generation, and the church of the 80s, or we could say now the church of the Audis, is not immune to meism. In fact, many declare our Zion has opted for a double dose. Clergy and parishioner alike calculate every move to maximize personal benefit. Today, our bonfires of selfishness are fueled by the gasoline of affluence. Today's self-centered churchgoer asks the same question of God coupled with another one. What will you do for me soon? What have you done for me lately, and what are you going to do for me anytime soon? God is pictured as the dispenser and the withholder of life's prizes, like a television game show host. We conclude that such things as good health, fortune, and success are such indicators of His approval for our lives. This is the Protestant ethic gone to seed. It was the same thing that plagued God's people as Malachi spoke to them. They were measuring their lives and measuring God's love by the things they had and the things they didn't have. And they were missing the bigger picture of the fact that they were called by God and loved by Him and chosen to be His special people. They had missed it. And so they were selfish, self-centered, and God says their consequences were thus self-destructive. Look in verse 15. So now we call the arrogant blessed. Not only are the doers of wickedness built up, but they test God and escape. He said they now have come to these self-destructive conclusions, that now they've decided that the evil are blessed by God. The evil make evil choices, and God doesn't do anything about it, so God must be okay with it. And it's not as if they're bringing these charges to God. Malachi pictures that they're huddling up. They're getting together in their religious people circles, and they're proclaiming that God has failed them. They're proclaiming that God has changed the rules or that God is unjust. And in doing so, they are killing themselves. If you're taking notes, jot down Psalm 73. In Psalm 73, the psalmist was wrestling with the very same thing. He looked around him and he saw the wicked having success. He saw those who were ungodly having lives of comfort. And I know that we see that today. We see people making poor choices and getting benefits out of those choices. And so it is very easy in our humanity to look and to wonder, God, what exactly are you up to? And in Psalm 73, the psalmist said, I had almost given up on God. I looked at the world and everything seemed to be turned upside down. Evil was good and good was evil, and it seemed as if God was not doing anything, because it is so easy to ask about the short term. God, what have you done for me lately, or what are you going to change very soon? But God is not a short-term God. I've mentioned it before. We are very microwave mentality people, but God is a crock-pot God. He works over time. And true love is not pretending and wanting fulfillment now. True love is described in these next three verses. And it's the contenders, those who are willing to hang around and those who are willing to fight for what is right. Because this is what the contenders do. They ask, what have I been for God lately? Not, God, what have you done for me? But God, what have I been for you? And what will I continue being for you? Look in verse 16. Then those who feared the Lord spoke to one another. And the Lord gave attention and heard it. And a book of remembrance was written before Him for those who fear the Lord and who esteem His name. Look at this. It says their motivation is God-centered. Those who truly love God and understand His love for them, they are the contenders. They are the ones who are going to make it to the end. 20 years ago, there was a huge fight in Tokyo, Japan. I was a senior in high school. We were all at a Valentine's dance, and James Buster Douglas was fighting the scariest man on the planet, Mike Tyson.